This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to provide students with help making their first reading of Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric. In this video we'll be studying through Chapter 1 of Book 1. I'll lead the students as they should read these texts in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And as we read through the required texts, we'll also stop here and there to discuss some important points, whether that has to do with the content of the lesson itself or the methods of our studying them. So let's not waste any time and jump right into Chapter 1 of Book 1 of Aristotle's Rhetoric. Rhetoric reciprocates with dialectic, for both are conversant with such particulars as, being common, may after a manner be known by all men, and pertain to no definite science. Hence, all men in a certain respect participate of both these. For all men, to a certain extent, endeavor to examine and sustain an argument, to defend and to accuse. With respect to the multitude, therefore, some of them do these things casually, but others through custom from habit. Because, however, this is possible in both ways, it is evident that these particulars may also be reduced to a certain method. For it is possible to survey the cause why some men render what they assert probable from custom, and others from chance. But all men now will acknowledge that a thing of this kind is the work of art. So in this first paragraph, Aristotle presents the first important concept, discussing the relationship between rhetoric and dialectic. He says that they reciprocate. They mutually benefit each other, giving and taking from one another. The student of dialectic who masters the art of dialectic will find that art helpful in the study of the art of rhetoric. And the student who pursues mastery of the art of rhetoric will find that his knowledge of this art enlightens the art of dialectic or logic. He says this is a peculiar subject of study in that it is of interest to all men. It is not of interest only to men who possess a mastery and interest in some particular science, but to all men. Because the topics studied in the art of rhetoric, as in the art of dialectic, are essential to human life. It's part of our life in this world. It's not a specialty. It's not a unique interest. It does not belong to any particular skill or any particular science. It does not require the knowledge of some other principles of other sciences in order to understand this science. It is a human science, and that's why it's numbered among the liberal arts. It is an art of human life, as is dialectic. Also because we can find examples of men who succeed in the work of rhetoric and dialectic, some casually, and what that means is by chance. They just happen to get lucky now and then. But others can cultivate a skill in these arts by custom and habit, by training, by study. And because it is possible to gain some mastery in these arts by means of study and practice, it appears therefore that an art does in fact exist that relates to these activities. And this is the art of rhetoric, which is the subject of this book. If it were not an art, this study would be a waste of time. And we find this in modern society. We find students in modern society, even adults in modern society, saying things like, I'm not a good writer, I'm not good at public speaking, I'm not good at drawing, I'm not good at singing, and so on. And when they say that, there's an assumption that those skills or those arts are not possible to be gained by study and practice, that there's no art to them. But the truth is that there is art in these things, and they're gained by study and practice. And therefore, because we can see that there is an art in this activity related to examining and sustaining arguments, defending and accusing, these essentially human activities, we have the motivation and we can move forward with confidence that this study of the art of rhetoric is possible and will produce good results if we devote ourselves to it. That's the content of the first paragraph of Aristotle's work on the art of rhetoric, which establishes the subject for us and assures us that it's worth our time and attention. Let's continue in the reading. Here Aristotle talks about the problem in his day. Remember, he's writing in the 4th century BC. He writes here about the problems with ideas about rhetoric in his day, and it'll be worth paying attention because these are the same problems that men have with regard to rhetoric in our day, in the 21st century. Aristotle says, "At present, those who compose the arts of orations, that is, they who unfold the art of rhetoric, explain only a small part of rhetoric." And we can see this in modern schools, where in a modern school you will not see teachers leading students through the art of rhetoric as we'll be studying it, but you'll see classes such as public speaking. You'll see classes titled critical thinking, or writing classes, composition classes. And as Aristotle complained 2,400 years ago, those who compose these arts explain only a small part of the real art, which is the art of rhetoric. And he says what they all miss and neglect is the study of what Aristotle calls here credibility or proof. Aristotle writes, "For credibility is the only artificial part of this art." By artificial here, he does not mean fake. We often use artificial in a negative sense in modern society. We say, that's not real, it's artificial. And that's not what the word means here. What the word means here, something that's artificial, is something that is produced by the exercise or practice of an art. It's a skill, the product of a skill, something that is produced by some skillful action is artificial. It's made by art. Credibility is the only artificial part of rhetoric. That is the real skill that makes or breaks one's mastery of the art of rhetoric is mastery of credibility, or the ability to prove. And this is neglected, Aristotle says, in the works of those who attempt to teach men to speak, and the same is true today. We have public speaking classes and writing classes among students who have never taken a logic class. Aristotle continues and says, the rhetoricians of the present day say nothing about enthymemes, which we'll learn more about later, which are the substantial part of credibility. But their attention is for the most part directed to things that are foreign to the purpose. For accusation, pity, anger, and such like passions of the soul do not pertain to the thing itself or the matter itself, which is to be proved, but to the judge. In other words, these fake rhetoricians, they are simply trying to move the affections of a judge or an audience rather than actually proving the truth. Hence, if all judicial processes were conducted in the same manner as they are at present in some cities, and especially in those that are governed by good laws, these fake rhetoricians would not have anything to say. In other words, if the standards in the courts were such that only true arguments and proofs were acceptable, and all of the other nonsense of these arts of public speaking and persuasion were not allowed in the courts, these fake rhetoricians wouldn't even have anything to say. And the same is true today. For with respect to all cities, some think it is necessary that the laws should thus ordain, that all of this rhetorical nonsense should be prohibited. But this method is adopted by others, and they forbid rhetoricians to say anything foreign to the purpose, in the same manner as in the Areopagus. And if you're curious as to what the Areopagus is, even though it's referring to a different generation several centuries later, you can read about the Areopagus in Acts chapter 17 of the New Testament, and I recommend you looking that up. In this respect, they think rightly, for it is not proper to pervert the judge by exciting him to anger, or to envy, or to pity, since this is just as if someone should make the rule distorted which he intends to use. Again, it is likewise manifest that the only business of the litigant is to show that a thing either is or is not, or that it has or has not been done. But with respect to such things as the legislator has not defined, the legislator is the lawmaker. In other words, when the lawmakers leave lots of room in the laws, they make the courts, or they put much more pressure on the courts to actually settle these matters. The pressure is then on the judges to make decisions in every single case, because the laws don't go far enough into detail to anticipate different circumstances and situations and prevent the trouble that can arise by loose or sloppy laws. Aristotle writes, "But with respect to such things as the legislator has not defined, whether they are great or small, just or unjust, these ought to be known by the judge himself. And he is not to learn them from the litigants," that is, those speaking in the court. "It is especially requisite, therefore, that laws which are rightly framed should define all such particulars as can be defined, and leave very little to be defined by the judge." And in the first place, indeed, this is requisite or necessary, because it is more easy to obtain one person or a few persons, that is, lawmakers. It's much easier to find one or a few wise men who can make laws for the whole state than to find many that are intelligent and wise, who are able to act the part of a legislator and a judge. We can see this in sacred scripture very clearly, because the Jewish people were governed by one man, Moses, the lawgiver. They lived according to the law of Moses. And Moses was an extremely wise man, a man educated in the wisdom of the Egyptians, and a man of great grace. He was a man with whom God spoke face to face. And the wisdom of the Israelite people was that they had the most excellent law given by one lawgiver who was an extremely wise and intelligent man. Their society was not dependent on the judgment of judges, but most of the decisions were made by the law itself, and the judges only had to judge specific matters within the limits of the laws. In the next place, Aristotle writes, "The establishment of laws is the effect of a survey from a long series of past time. But judgments are the result of a survey from recent times, so that it is difficult for those who judge to attribute what is just and advantageous in a becoming manner." In other words, a lawmaker can deliberate and dispute and discuss things and research and study, and in a long time can produce a small number of carefully considered laws, whereas a judge is required to work under the pressure of present arguments and needs to give an immediate judgment, which is very difficult to do. And it's much safer for the life of a state to be guided by the careful deliberation of a lawmaker than by the difficult judgments of living judges under the influence of persuasive orators. That, however, Aristotle continues, which is the greatest reason of all, is that the judgment of the legislator is not conversant with particulars, but with future events and with universal ideas. The law deals with, for example, the law will say, "Thou shalt not kill," and speak universally of all killing. Whereas the question in a court is whether or not a particular act is in fact an act of murder or of a certain species of killing. Lawmaking is conversant with particulars, not with particulars, but with future events and universals. But the judgment of the barrister and the judge in the court is directed to present and definite circumstances with which love and hatred and private advantage are frequently conjoined. In other words, there are often conflicts of interest, and the judges can be compromised, so that they are no longer sufficiently able to survey the truth, but their own peculiar pleasure or pain darkens their judgment. In other words, the lawmakers are discussing cases that have no effect on their personal lives because they are making laws to govern future cases, and they are therefore free from these difficulties and distractions and temptations. Whereas the judges are making judgments among their own fellow countrymen in their own times, and the effects of their judgments can threaten or harm their lives. With respect to other particulars, it is necessary, as we have said, that very little should be left in the power of the judge. But with respect to the enquiry, whether a thing has been done or has not been done, or whether it will or will not take place, or is not, it is necessary that this should be left to the judges. For it is not possible excuse me, it is not possible that these things should be foreseen by the legislator. So, in order to have a well-run state, the judgment of the law should be limited to simple, present questions of whether or not the conditions of the laws are fulfilled in specific cases. But judges should not be allowed to serve as both lawmaker and judge. And the reason why, the whole reason why Aristotle is discussing this, is because giving too much power to the judges is what gives these fake rhetoricians the opportunity to do the evil that they do. If the laws are composed wisely and carefully, this whole practice of this misleading, sophistical arguing in courts, bribing and persuading judges falsely, and so on, would be eliminated from the state. And then the true art of rhetoric would be the only speech allowed in these courts. Aristotle goes on and says, if then this be the case, it is evident that those rhetoricians who define other parts of an oration except credibility, such, for instance, as what the proem, the introduction that is, or the narration, where the speaker gives an overview of the events in the case, should contain, and each of the other parts of an oration, these exercise their art in things foreign to the purpose. These matters of how to compose an oration and what parts an oration should consist of and how these different parts should be composed, Aristotle is saying the courts should not even need the litigants to provide that information. In these, they effect nothing else except delivering the method by which the judge may be influenced. But they demonstrate nothing respecting artificial credibility, namely, whence someone may become enthymematic or possess the power of discovering artificial proofs of that which is the subject of the controversy. Aristotle's arguing that that's the actual duty of the rhetorician, to discover proofs of that which is the subject of controversy. And notice he says artificial proofs. So we're not talking about evidence in a case. If there's a murder, for example, and there's a photograph or a video of the events and we can see the evidence, that's not artificial proof. And he'll talk about this more later. The role of those speaking in the courtroom is to produce artificial proof by means of deduction. And a good example of this that's dramatized is the work of Sherlock Holmes. To consider the evidence and by means of deduction to prove different matters within a case that require the skill of one who studies the arts of rhetoric and dialectic. Hence, Aristotle writes, though there is the same method respecting popular and judicial orations, and the popular is better and more political than the method pertaining to contracts, yet rhetoricians of the present day are silent as to the popular method, but all of them endeavor to unfold the art pertaining to the judicial genus, because it is less advantageous in popular orations to assert what is foreign to the purpose. And a popular oration is less pernicious than a judicial discussion, but is more common. For in the former, the judge decides about appropriate concerns, so that nothing else is necessary than to show that the thing is as the counselor asserts it to be. In judicial processes, however, this is not sufficient, but it is requisite to pay attention to the hearer, for the decision is concerning things of a foreign nature. Hence the judges, looking to their own advantage and regarding their own pleasure, gratify the litigants, but do not decide with justice. Hence, too, as I have before observed, in many places the law forbids anything foreign to the purpose to be said. And in these places this law is sufficiently observed by the judges themselves. So we just see Aristotle drawing attention to how the laws either free the judge from these potential evils and pressures by providing sufficient detail, covering all of the different circumstances in a universal way, in a detached way, so that the judge doesn't need to deal with these things, all the processes of the courtroom and what the litigants can say and cannot say, what they can speak of and cannot speak of. If all of these things are dealt with by wise and just laws, then these sophists, these false speakers and fake rhetoricians can be kept out of the courts, and they can be made incapable of doing evil. But if the laws are careless and lazy and insufficient, the judges are left as targets for these men to carry out evil plans. The true art of rhetoric, Aristotle is arguing, is not the art of persuading a judge or manipulating an audience. That's the fake art, which evil men are interested in. The true art of rhetoric, as he'll soon define, is to be able, by the power of the art, to discover proofs for the subject at hand. Let's continue reading. Since, however, it is evident that the artificial method is conversant with credibility, but credibility is a certain demonstration, or a kind of demonstration. For we then especially believe in a thing when we think it is accompanied with demonstration or proof. And a rhetorical demonstration, so one kind of demonstration, is an enthymeme. There's that word enthymeme. And as I always say, when Aristotle uses a term and you're not familiar with what that term means, you can be sure that he's going to explain it in another place. Just be patient. Don't run to a dictionary. Don't try to think what the word means based on things you've heard, because you're likely going to be wrong. Just continue studying Aristotle's text, and you'll find that he provides a clear explanation for any term he uses in the appropriate place. And here we see he's explaining now what an enthymeme is, which he mentioned before. An enthymeme is a certain kind of demonstration. It is a rhetorical demonstration. Aristotle writes, and this, in short, possesses the greatest authority of all credibilities or proofs. An enthymeme is a certain syllogism. An enthymeme is a kind of syllogism. And it is the province either of the whole or of a certain part of dialectic to pay attention similarly to every syllogism. In other words, dialectic is the art and science of the syllogism itself and all kinds of syllogisms. If you want to learn of the different kinds of syllogisms, you do so through the study of the art of reasoning. And we study that in the Academy's classical reasoning courses. Different kinds of reasoning. All the different kinds of reasoning are studied in the Organon, in the different books of the Organon. It is the part of dialectic to pay attention to every syllogism. This being the case, it is evident that he who is eminently capable of surveying this, namely, from what propositions and how a syllogism may be made, he will be especially enthymematic, in consequence of assuming what the particulars are with which enthymemes are conversant, and what differences they possess with respect to logical syllogisms. So a man who masters the art of reasoning and learns of all of the different kinds of arguments that exist, that man will take from dialectic the benefits and bring those benefits into the study of rhetoric, because true rhetoric has to do with proof. Aristotle continues, "For it is the province of the same power to perceive truth and what is similar to truth, and at the same time men are by nature sufficiently adapted to the perception of truth, and for the most part obtain it." Notice that Aristotle has a positive view of human nature, that men are capable of discerning the truth and for the most part obtain it. Hence, he who sagaciously conjectures probabilities is disposed similarly to him who perceives truth. That others, therefore, artificially discuss things foreign to the purpose, and why they especially incline to judicial precepts, is evident from what has been said. In other words, as he ends this paragraph, he says, we've explained why men who write on rhetoric don't address the real issue of credibility and the art of proving. And it's because that's not what they're actually interested in. We also can see into their motives by the fact that they are not interested in all kinds of rhetorical activity or speaking, but only in the kind that relates to the courts, where they can try to influence judges, because that's where the things that they're interested in take place. These two things reveal the real nature of these men. First, that they're not interested at all in studying how to prove anything, but only how to move the judge. And secondly, they're not interested in all kinds of oration, but only those which are used in the courts, where they do their work. Aristotle continues and says, "But rhetoric is useful because things that are true and just are naturally more excellent than their contraries." And this is a key principle in this entire study and in all reasoning and speaking and arguing. Rhetoric is useful because things that are true and just are naturally more excellent than their contraries, so that unless judgments are formed according to what is fit, what is more excellent will be vanquished by its contrary, and this is a thing worthy of reprehension. In other words, when men don't study and learn the true arts of reasoning and rhetoric, even though the truth is easier to prove and defend than a lie or a falsehood, these men, because of their lack of skill in the true arts of reasoning and rhetoric, cause the truth to appear to be inferior or not as persuasive as the lies of cunning and skillful men. And again, this is a problem that Christians face today. Farther still, Aristotle writes, though we should possess the most accurate science, it is not easy when we speak to persuade some persons by employing that science. For a scientific oration proceeds from discipline, and it is impossible from this to persuade the unlearned. But it is necessary when addressing these to procure credibility and frame arguments from such things as are common. And Aristotle says, just as we have asserted in the Topics, that's one of the books of the Organon. So Aristotle explains in this last sentence that a scientific oration, if you're going to speak from some scientific knowledge, it's not going to be helpful because only men who have already been convinced of the principles of that science are going to be able to understand and accept with confidence the conclusions of that science. And the common people, those who do not know these sciences, these arguments will have no effect on them. And if the truth depends on such scientific arguments, then the common people will not be moved. And the sophists, with their arguments, their false arguments, will be able to influence the common people. And those who represent the truth, because they offer proofs that are not convincing, will cause the truth to appear less attractive to the common people. Aristotle goes on and writes, farther still, the power of being able to persuade contraries, or the ability of disputing on each side of a question, is necessary, in the same manner as in syllogisms, not in order that we may actually do both, as if we're ever going to actually try to persuade people to believe what is false. It is not proper to persuade to what is base, but that we may not be ignorant how contraries subsist, and that when another person employs those arguments unjustly, we may be able to solve them, or to reveal their errors, to refute them. No one, therefore, of the other arts syllogistically concludes contraries. In other words, we need to exercise ourselves in proving and disproving both sides of every contradiction, of every controversy, so that we not only know how to prove what is true, but we also understand the arguments made to attempt to prove what is false. No one of other arts syllogistically concludes contraries, but this is alone effected by dialectic and rhetoric. For both of them are similarly conversant with contraries, though the things which are the subjects of their consideration do not subsist similarly, but always, as I may say, things which are true and naturally more excellent are more syllogistic and adapted to procure persuasion. Besides, it is absurd that it should be shameful for a man not to be able to give assistance to his body, and that it should not be shameful for him not to be able to assist himself by his reasoning power, which is more the peculiarity of man than the use of his body. If, however, it should be objected that he who uses unjustly the rhetorical power may injure others in a great degree, this objection is common to everything that is good, except virtue, and especially to the most useful things such as strength, health, riches, and military command. For he who uses things of this kind justly may benefit others in the greatest degree, and by using them unjustly may effect the greatest injury. That rhetoric, therefore, is not conversant with one certain definite genus of things, but resembles in this respect dialectic, which applies to all things, and that it is useful is evident. It is likewise evident that the employment of rhetoric is not to persuade. Make sure you listen to that. The employment of rhetoric is not to persuade. Rhetoric is not the art of persuasion, but to perceive on every subject what is adapted to procure persuasion. The employment of rhetoric is not to persuade, not to simply move people to agree with us, but to perceive on every subject what is adapted to procure persuasion in the same manner as in all other arts. For it is not the business of medicine to produce health, but to do everything as much as possible which may procure it. Since the healing art may be well exercised upon those who are incapable of being restored to health. In other words, the end result of persuading people of the truth is not in our power, and therefore it is not the true end of the art of rhetoric, just as health is really not the true end of the art of medicine, because a physician, even if he practices medicine perfectly, may still not be able to bring about health in a certain patient he's caring for. In addition, likewise, to what has been said, it is the province of the same power to perceive what is persuasive and what appears to be so, just as it is the province of dialectic to discern what is a true and what is only an apparent syllogism. For the sophistical art does not consist in the power of reasoning, but in deliberate choice, except that here indeed, namely in the rhetorical art, one man will be a rhetorician from science, but another from deliberate choice. There, however, namely in dialectic or logic, the sophist indeed is from deliberate choice, but the logician is not from deliberate choice, but from the power of reasoning. If you're wondering what deliberate choice is, I recommend that you go and read Aristotle's Ethics, Book 3. I believe it's chapters 2 and 3. He speaks of deliberate choice. And so this brings us to the end of chapter 1. You can see that the general aim of chapter 1 is for Aristotle to explain what the true art of rhetoric is and why there are other practices that are referred to as rhetoric which are false and not the true art, so that we can understand what our true purpose is here as we begin the study of the art of rhetoric. Our goal is not simply to persuade people to agree with us, not simply to persuade people to buy our product or vote for us in the election. That's not the goal of an honest man, simply to make others do his will or agree with him. The goal in the study of rhetoric is to be able to understand in every subject what is capable of procuring persuasion. And it's important to always remember the comparison that Aristotle made with medicine. That a good physician does not consider what needs to be done to heal the person because that's not in his power. He considers what is capable of producing healing. And he understands that that's his only job, to exhaust all possible sources of healing. And if he's done that, and the patient does not recover, the physician knows that he did his job. And in the same way, if a rhetorician knows all of the available sources of persuasion and exhausts them, and the people or the judge or the audience still will not be persuaded, the rhetorician will have done his duty. Aristotle wants us to understand that, so as we get into the art of rhetoric, we can understand what our purpose is and focus on the true art. That's all for our reading through chapter 1 of book 1. I hope that reading was helpful. I'm sure it was for new students. I'm sure you have lots of questions, but what I ask is that you follow the instructions that I give in my article on how to study for mastery, and work on studying this chapter for yourself, complete the lesson assignments. Allow me to work with you individually through your assessment work. And if you have any questions, contact me either on the forums, where others can read the answers to the questions and discussions, or privately, where I can write back and forth with you and help you with questions that come up as you study. I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.